Good morning. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jennifer Turner. I direct the China Environment Forum here. I'm one of but 20 programs at the Wilson Center that focuses on foreign policy issues. We've got a Middle East, environmental change and security program. Those are two of them, and they're co-sponsors for today's meeting. Yeah, the Wilson Center has been around since 1968. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy think tank here in DC. And I've been around the Wilson Center for 23 years. And a lot of the work of my forum has looked at climate, energy issues, a lot on US-China relations, but I'm a water person. In fact, so a lot of my projects, I kind of infuse water into them. Like back in 2010, we did a 9-year project with Circle of Blue called Choke Point China, where we looked at the water, energy, food confrontations in China, investigating in particular coal's water footprint. It was a topic back in 2010 that wasn't big on the policy or research agenda, and it was probably by one really big splash, dare I say, in China. We're getting more people to pay attention to that topic. Today we have this fall we have a new project that we've launched with support from the Luce Foundation called Vulnerable Deltas, and we're going to be looking at, for the next 4 years with the East-West Center, looking at climate, pollution, and development pressures on deltas in Southeast Asia and China. I give you that kind of context because, you know, I like doing water and kind of supporting the Vulnerable Deltas project. Today, we've got a webinar that's going to be looking broadly at water resilience issues. You saw that if you've tuned in, thank you for doing that. You see that the title is called Seeking Innovative Solution for Thirsty Rivers in China, the US, and the Middle East. So I've pulled you in on the idea that after the heat wave and the floods, that we've got lots of problems around the globe with the heat wave, and that we don't clearly, all around the world, we're not ready in terms of our water management and climate preparedness to deal with climate change and how it's impacting our water. So in the run up to, we're coming on the eve of the November climate conference in Egypt. So I've brought together 3 water experts to kind of dive into, I'm going to do a lot of water puns, so just groan or tune them out. We're going to dive in some of the obstacles and solutions to help make our rivers and our broader water ecosystems more resilient to climate change. We're going to start off with today with John Matthews, who co-founded the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation back in 2010 with the World Bank. And he focuses a lot on the intersection of water with climate adaptation and resilience. And he's going to kind of set the stage to help us think about, well, what do we mean by water resilience and climate? And then we're going to talk Suzanne Schmeier, who is an associate professor of water law and diplomacy at IHE Delft. Her research, teaching, and advisory work has focused on the legal and institutional dimensions of water resource management at both the subnational and she's done a lot on transboundary water conflicts around the world. She's really, for our environmental change and security program, she's been involved in lots of other webinars and writing, talking about how the kind of water insecurity and conflict has actually kind of helped pave the way for some kind of water-based cooperation between countries. And last but not least is Ma Jun, who's been involved in my project almost from the start, back in the day. He is the founder and head of the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, IPE, as it's normally known. He's also a Wilson Center Global Fellow. His NGO is probably the most dynamic in China, that focuses on information transparency around pollution and other environmental trends. He actually created the first water pollution database in China, and it's only been expanded massively from there. So he's going to talk about his organization's work on information transparency around water and kind of what that means for water resiliency. So I think we're ready now. John, I pass the virtual mic over to you. And also reminding the audience that look underneath the screen here, and you'll see a Q&A widget, event chat. So send me questions starting now, because when the 3 are done, I'd like to be able to pepper them with your challenging questions. And thank you very much. And John, I will mute and you can start the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate being invited by the Wilson Center to this event, and I feel really honored to be here with such esteemed colleagues, Susanna and Ma Jun. I'd like to really start off by saying that the main narrative that we hear around water and climate in the media is I think overwhelming and often overwhelmingly depressing. It's the story of extreme events. It's about often great loss, the 1,200-year drought that we see in California, or the multi-century scale flooding that we see in Pakistan. Um, I've been, as Jennifer mentioned, I've been working on water and climate issues, especially from an adaptation resilience perspective, for about 15 years now. And my sense is actually that the impacts are distraction. That the real crisis that we have from climate change around water management is not from the impacts themselves. It actually comes from some of the special issues that we have with the way that we manage water, the way that we engage with the water cycle. It's really, I would call it a crisis in decision making. And an example of that is that water is embedded throughout all of our economies, and we see water enmeshed in our energy systems, in our agriculture systems, and how we think about what a viable city looks like. It's not just water supply and sanitation issues. Water is all around us. I'm literally talking to you based on the electricity that was generated through water-intensive energy sources. And the second part of that is that much of our decision-making processes, they around water management, they often mask where the water is. So someone who's running, say, a coal-fired power plant, or a natural gas generating facility, or even a nuclear power plant, doesn't realize that they actually are a water manager. They're not thinking about the water resources that they're engaging with. Even farmers are people who are engaged with a kind of larger food system. They may be actively irrigating, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as making active water decisions. A second part of that is that most of the ways that we are influencing water, they tend to have a really long lifetime. So they, for instance, hydropower, one of the really great innovations for humans is a relatively inexpensive way to make electricity. The very first commercial scale hydropower facility started in the 1870s, Niagara Falls, in the U.S.-Canadian border. It's still in operation. London's urban water supply system, the oldest parts of it really go back to the mid 1600s, and a really ancient city like, let's say, Lahore in Pakistan, a city that was old when Alexander the Great showed up 2,000 years ago. It was actually shaped by its own internal water distribution network, its own water system. The impacts that we have around water infrastructure span a really long time, at least decades, and often centuries, and potentially even longer. And traditionally, over the last 200 years or so, the way that we've tried to think about managing, planning, developing those systems is that we look backwards. We try to say, here are 3 points in a line over the past few decades, maybe the past 100 years, and here are going to be the next few points in that line into the future. And climate change is profoundly disruptive. It's it's not necessarily the next 2 points in that line. It's probably a sharp curve. And so we have much larger uncertainties, and we have a much weaker governance, design, planning, stakeholder engagement systems for how we try to think about what those management systems, those design choices, the governance system should look like into the future. And maybe what does that look like in practical terms? One of the I think that as the kind of poster child of uh, where we are right now at the intersection of climate and water is uh, some of the great infrastructure on the planet that was created over the last few decades. Maybe the most famous one from a climate perspective is the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. Still one of the world's largest dams. It's about 85 years old this year. It's actually going to have the water levels behind that dam in the reservoir fall below the intake tunnels for its primary exits in the next 1 or 2 years. It's designed for a climate that doesn't exist anymore. And we had a lot of hubris when we designed it. We didn't think what happens if our assumptions about what the future of this basin looks like are wrong if they change. And that matters because when the Hoover Dam, when they first started pouring concrete for it, the nearest city, Las Vegas, it had 5,000 people in it. It has almost 2 million now. The region of part of the Southwest, it had maybe 200,000, 300,000 people who lived in it. It has over 40 million people in it. And effectively, we locked in a whole range of choices and assumptions by this one piece of infrastructure. And it was our economic development strategy in the US at that time to really increase wealth, to define prosperity. It was wildly successful. And it's also now proving to be based on a hydrological lie. And this is an example that we see proliferating around the world. The same methodologies that we use to design the Hoover Dam are essentially unchanged in most places. We don't de-risk very effectively from a climate perspective with most of our water choices, either from the governance perspective or the planning, design, and operations perspective. So we see much younger pieces of infrastructure. The Kariba Dam on the Zambezi in East Africa is only about as old as I am, about a little over 50 years old, and it has 5% generation capacity during the dry season now, straining a vast region of East Africa in terms of its economic development. I worry about some of the dam development that we see in the Horn of Africa, in Turkey, in South Asia, for the same reasons. So the answer is what I think of as water resilience. And water resilience is something I feel very very positive about, and it's a forward-looking approach. Like if we could go back to the people who designed the Hoover Dam, what would we tell them differently? And I think what we try to say that we need to be much more humble about what the future looks like. We need to think about redundancy. We need to think about flexibility in operations, maybe building in stages with a potential to unbuild as necessary. We also need to think of the water cycle more generally as dynamic, and our ability to interact with it in a much more dynamic way. And I feel excited about this because I actually see evidence of new generations of engineers and planners and governance specialists, even politicians, that are starting to embrace this kind of resilience framework. It's early days yet, but it's interesting. And one of the reasons that I'm most excited about it as a biologist is that I also see that we're starting to try to bring natural systems like aquifers, about nature-based solutions such as wetlands, trying to think about them in a dynamic but integrated way into our management systems. And I think this is a powerful approach. I see evidence in finance institutions, in public sector, and even in the private sector, really starting to move dramatically in this direction. So hopefully this is a good kind of a start for the conversation. I hand it back over to you, Jennifer. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you laid out some really important foundational ways of thinking about this. And I know you probably know this, but I remember I was shocked. I don't know why I was shocked. I guess because no one really knows this. Like in Virginia, that their water infrastructure dates back to the Civil War or it's like, whoa, no wonder we have problems still. I mean, I'm in Maryland, but I think our infrastructure is pretty dang old too. Lots of water pipes exploding left and right. And that's just me in my area. All right, Suzanne, I'm passing the mic over to you and let's get the conversation moving. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I'm going to take you to a specific region. I'm going to take you to the Middle East and North Africa, because that is, as you'll probably all be aware of, a region that is facing a severe water crisis already, but that will be facing an even more severe water crisis as climate change hits. We know already now, and I'll talk about the future in a bit, but already now, 2/3 of the population in the MENA region live in water scarce areas. Just to give you a comparison, it's 35% on the global average, but 2/3, so more than 60% for the MENA region. We also know from studies recently done by the World Bank and others that by 2025, which is around the corner, 90 million people in the region will suffer from water scarcity or water stress, actually. Many people will have to leave their lands because agriculture is not possible anymore, or it's reduced to a level that it becomes inefficient and people can't survive of these livelihoods anymore. That will, of course, have effects on the economies of the countries, but also on individual people losing their livelihoods and looking for other ways to sustain their lives, which often means migrating to the next cities, becoming city dwellers, or actually migrating out of country. We also know from studies that have recently been done that the water crisis itself will probably lead to a reduction in the region's GDP in average by 6 to 14% by 2050, a region that is already suffering from economic crisis, but will also suffer from falling oil prices and countries phasing out oil as a response to climate change. And that, of course, all comes with certain social impacts, health impacts, but also destruction of ecosystems. We've seen many lakes and wetlands dry out in the region. Think about Lake Urmia in Iran or the marshes in Iraq around Basra that are heavily affected. But also, and John alluded to this as well, the question of infrastructure in the MENA region at the same time. We do not have the infrastructure in place that would help to address the water crisis. Infrastructure is similar to what John just mentioned, often old, but on top of that has, at least in some parts of the region, been destroyed by war, civil war, and violence. A lot of the irrigation infrastructure in Syria, for example, has been destroyed as a context of the conflict there. Or it's just not been maintained due to either the lack of capacity of funding resources, or if we think about Iran, also as a consequence of the sanctions and the inability to get the technology that would be needed. So all of that is leading to a crisis that goes beyond the water crisis and will do so even more in the future when we think climate change, with, as I said, people migrating, but people also potentially protesting. We've seen protests 2018 quite prominently in Iraq, when in the south of Iraq, many people died and thousands were hospitalized as a consequence of bad water quality that people were drinking. And that led to protests that increased and at some point generally focused on the government's inability to manage public services beyond water. We've seen protests in Iran where people either protested against the water policies more generally or against the allocation of water resources, for example, between urban and rural areas, favoring the urban areas, and then as a consequence, farmers protesting or even attacking water pipes, for example, that supply cities in most prominently the Sangandurut Basin. But we're also, of course, seeing the effects, the destabilizing effects of countries becoming fragile way beyond the region. What's important, though, and that is something or a key point that I would like to make, is that yes, we're talking about a water crisis that will definitely deteriorate with the effects of climate change, especially as the region is one of the regions most heavily affected by climate change. But we're also really seeing a water crisis. So it is not only a governance crisis, sorry. So it's not only about water and climate but what's behind it is a governance crisis that has led the region into the situation that it's in now, but that also, if it persists, will really be a challenge for the region to address the impacts of climate change and build resilience over time. I think that's pretty clear so far to governments. Individual governments have very openly and strongly called for changes in water management. The Arab Ministerial Council on Water has issued quite some years ago already a statement asking to urgently address the water crisis in the region, but very little has happened on the ground so far. And this is for various reasons. I'll only give you a few examples. There are many, many more. First of all, governments, for example, struggle with enforcing water demand management strategies because that would require significantly reducing the water use. And that, of course, often comes and has already come in Iraq, for example, with protests. Water prices go up or water is less available, and that leads to protests by the population. And we have to keep in mind here that the water use, thinking of Iran, for example, is actually quite high. So there is certainly a potential to save water. There is a potential to manage water differently by valuing water differently, but then introducing prices or increasing prices for water has been a real challenge for government stability so far. Another issue that I would like to highlight is also the transboundary level. And the MENA region is a region where we see the most conflict over transboundary water resources in the world compared to other regions, both over surface and groundwater, but where we at the same time have the lowest density in international treaties and no basin organization. So high likelihood and high risk of conflict over water, but very limited legal and institutional capacity. So yeah, just from these few examples, you can see that to a large extent, the water crisis in the MENA crisis is a governance crisis that I think needs to or should be addressed along 3 dimensions that we can maybe use to engage in a discussion later. First of all, I would say it's very much about demand management and efficiency, which obviously also includes technology that can enhance resilience. It's a lot about addressing water loss and inefficiencies. It's a lot about increasing the efficiency in the water sector. In the MENA region, the water sector uses 90% of all the water, whereas the global average is 70%. It's also about pricing, urban loss management, and so on. But this is really just the demand management side. I think on top of that, and probably more importantly, comes water governance more broadly, the ability of governments to not only develop laws, regulations, and policies that provide clear boundaries, a clear framework for managing water, but actually also implementing this. And that's something that we see in many of the countries in the region, that water laws are in place. They're actually quite modern and quite well developed, but the implementation is really lacking, either because of the fact that the state is fragile and has limited control over certain areas, or simply because the government fears the repercussions of actually enforcing certain water laws. We've seen that in Iran a lot. There are studies that assume that 1/3 of all wells in Iran that are drawing groundwater are actually illegal. And the government has really been struggling with closing or plugging these wells, and has, when they did, faced quite a bit of protest. And that leads me to the 3rd dimension that I think we need action on. It goes beyond the water sector. It's about addressing the socioeconomic and political dimension of water insecurity. So dealing with the conflict and the instability potential that water holds, not only in terms of preventing and mitigating conflict, but also in turning this conflict potential into a cooperation potential, which from other regions in the world we know exists and we know can bring a lot of benefits. So that relates to issues such as having mechanisms to deal with grievances from the population, setting up legal institutional mechanisms that can also not only manage water, but ensure equity and fairness in water management, can manage disputes as they arise between different water users or even between entire countries. And I'll keep it to that so that we have a bit more time for discussion. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Again, kind of like what John, you do have, I mean, you gave some pretty sad stories, but positive look on some of the identifying the problems and how to move forward. All right, Ma Jun, Oh, before we go, reminding the audience that you can ask questions in the event chat box that's underneath the stream. And I haven't gotten a question yet, so please start submitting. Okay, Ma-Jun, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you see my screen okay?
I can see the screen, and just once you put it into a blue map for 0, I love it.
Yeah,
Okay, looks beautiful. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for your invitation. So glad to have the chance to meet and discuss virtually on this very issue of water. It's just we just came back to this after 20 years with my Woodrow Wilson first Woodrow Wilson program arranged by Jennifer. Really appreciate it. And this is the map of the global overall water risk. When it comes to China, we can see that the northern part of China has just only got less than 20% of the total water resources, and the southern part is relatively less risk situation. And so got more than 80%, Yangtze River and to the south. I mean, that helped to explain that about the absolute water scarcity in the northern part of China, and with the per capita water resources in the city of Beijing in recent years could drop to around 120 cubic meters, extremely low. And so that came, the solution was proposed to borrow water, transfer water from the south to the north, and now after 20 years, now we have two transferring canals being built, one in the middle route and the eastern route, and now every 10 cups we drink in Beijing, 7 came from the south, from this reservoir, the largest man-made lakes in the East Asia region. It's called Danjiangkou, and we can check about water. It's grade 2 and grade 1, so high quality water. But not everywhere is like that. Those decades of development, environment has paid a very heavy price. So water scarcity is just one part of it, and water pollution is actually damaging whatever limited resources we have, and posed a major health risk to the people. And so 16 years ago, when we decided to build a NGO to address this water issue, my conclusion was that we needed to engage with the stakeholders, extensive public participation. So it's a new form of governance. But all this need to start from transparency. So as Jennifer mentioned, we built the first public water pollution database called the China Water Pollution Map, and that's the prototype for the Blue Map database. And today, at that time, I assure you, we can only compile very limited information, but through all these years of efforts made by various stakeholders, including our own, and we have seen a vast expansion of information. I mean, on this map, you can see 20,000 monitoring stations, mostly on the surface water, but also the coastal seas and drinking water sources, and a few of groundwater as well. And now increasingly the disclosure became more regularly on the monitoring of the water quality. So every month we got the data from this site. You can check that. It's all on our website called the Blue Map, and you can check that. And the Blue Map is an environmental database. We compile all this data from first and foremost from the government agencies in China. Data could be viewed as quite sensitive, so we started with government monitoring data. But today we track 5,000 sources and compile all this data on the environmental quality, but also the emission data, including the real-time monitoring data from the online automatic monitoring, and people and develop that into the Blue Map app. And our users use that to share the information on social media, filing micro-reporting against the polluting factories. In the meantime, well, our app has also been connected with the two ministries, Black and Smelly River reporting platform, and so far 12,000 reports have been made by users and from 2,200 cities, and according to the rule, within 7 working days, initial response and then follow-up checks. And these are some of the pictures, photos taken. And our data is also being used quite extensively by some of the largest brands in the world who source from China. Look at this map. This is the center of the global textile industry. And we can see sometimes water can run in literally black, but all these brands began to compare their list with our list and of violators and motivate change. And today, many of them started putting their own logo on top of their suppliers. And actually, next week we're going to formally launch our accountability map, and just to highlight all these different listed companies and top consumer brands, not just about their commitment, but also about their actual performance and progress made in terms of supply chain management. Today, we're tracking more than 10 million companies and color code them, and this data is being used by major banks and investors. And through all these efforts, we can see some change with the water quality index we developed based on all the data I just mentioned. 2006, the worse than category 5, meaning that good for no use water account for 28%. And last year, it dropped to 1.2%. This is the water quality index map for the Yangtze River Basin. We can see some progress also been made on the Yellow River Basin. So on the, I would say on the water quality side, we really made major progress. And through the transfer, the water crisis have been mitigated in the, in the west, in the northern part of China. But the resilience, talking about resilience, the new challenge of the climate change, and this year the Yangtze River Valley suffers from the worst, the kind of unprecedented heat wave that drag on for nearly 2 months, and in this 2 months of time, the precipitation, the rainfall have declined by almost like 50%, and in some regions, like in Sichuan and Chongqing, for a period of time, declined by 80%, and that has made a very big impact on the on not just water supply and water irrigation, but also on the energy supply, because 80% of the installation capacity in that region are hydropower. And talking about hydropower, this has made a major impact on our freshwater biodiversity. That's another story. And today, on this right-hand side, you can see the in the Poyang Lake watershed, the largest freshwater lake. in August, I took a bird's eye view over that largest lake. During the monsoon season, I was shocked to see how this lake has been diminished into a meandering stream, and with a large scratch of large piece of sandy bottom exposed under the scorching sun. And today the drought still linger on, still continues in that region. So this is obviously the background, and most of the scientists believe it has something to do with climate change, because this is unprecedented low water mark for that lake and for the Yangtze River in that section. And but whether this is going to be a new norm or just a 1 year, whether this year, obviously the subtropical high have dominated not just our region, but in many parts in the northern hemisphere, causing this wildfire, heat wave and drought in Europe, in Central Asia, and in America. But whether this is going to be a new norm with the climate change, I mean, that's the question. And obviously we need to tackle climate change, so we're tapping into the experience by building a blue map for zero carbon, highlight all this, not just the access to data, but also develop index on different provinces and cities, and try to highlight all this, and also develop the data infrastructure to help carbon labeling, and help people to take picture to understand the embedded carbon, and doing their own recycling of plastic. And that's our work, to try to tap into the digital solutions. I just I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just think, back in the day, it was just one map. And now I can't even count how many maps you guys have now. Yeah, so I think we'll open it up for the Q&A. Want to encourage the audience to start. I have a couple questions that came in. Please keep them flowing in. And maybe I think I want to start. I'm going to ask Ma Jun a question, and then I want to maybe spread to the other two. So you talked about how you have made these amazing maps that have been kind of lighting a fire underneath corporations to clean up their supply chains, and the number about how black rivers are now only like 1.2%. That's fabulous news. But can you just say a few things about, I mean, so that's your piece, that you've been shining a light on this, but what is the Chinese government, what is Chinese policy, what actions have been happening with the government just in general that have also helped make this happen? Because both Suzanne and John talked about that, water governance is key. And so, so maybe, how did your work kind of link with the government policies, if that made sense?
Yeah. I want to make clear that, as I said, our water data, the data we started gathering, all came from the government monitoring. In China, that's crucial. That was crucial. Even with that, we were under a lot of pressure at the beginning, by posting so many violators on our map. But what we do is try to work with the government to encourage more disclosure, monitoring and disclosure. And through the process, I think the government have changed its policy, before its development at whatever cost. But over the past 10 years, the so-called eco-civilization have been highlighted as one of the 5 pillars in our overall development theme. And through the process, we have also been involved in the legislation. And so 2015, China came out with one of the so-called the most stringent environmental law in our history, and actually copied some of the toughest measures from the American legislation, like the daily penalty fine. When it is connected with the transparency over the online monitoring, then that become quite powerful. And then citizen litigation, I wouldn't put it. Yeah, we learned from the citizen suit, but in China, it's a group of NGOs got the status to file litigation, and the online monitoring obviously provide all this evidence needed, and then the Chinese government also launched after the Clean Air Action Plan. Chinese government launched a Clean Water Action Plan, and so try to address from this issue from the sources, and then of course not just I mentioned about the bottom-up part, but the government also tap into the absolute authority of the central government by launching the so-called central government environmental inspection, sending out tens of thousands of inspectors to the counties, even to the towns, to the villages, to try to take the people's reporting as a clue to try to hold accountable not just the polluting factories, but also those major those officials in charge who fail the duty. So obviously, this is not a kind of a multi-stakeholder efforts in China. Our governance is a different form, but on the environment side, more consensus have been made on this issue. This is important to the public interest, to everyone. So the government is actually talking about building a modern environmental governance which is led by the government, but the corporations need to assume their principal role, principal duty, and then the NGO and the public will have a chance to participate. Stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Majun. So just so you know, everyone knows, he just took like 10 years of water history and scrunched it into less than 5. So thank you. John, when I've been watching your videos and listen, some of the things that Majun was saying reminded me of some of the talks I was watching you giving about got it all hands on deck. Can you give us some examples of maybe in other countries where you see, maybe different from China, but where stakeholders coming together in ways that, to deal with like what you mentioned in your comments, like kind of like the invisible, unknown embeddedness of water in everything?
Sure. It's a great question. One of my favorite examples is actually from Thailand. There's a city that's second largest city in Thailand, Udon Thani. It's on the Mekong, quite close to the Chinese border, and it serves as kind of a ground transport between Southeast Asia and China. So it's big, and it's continuing to rapidly grow. But it also has an older economy. The rice irrigation is still really important there. It's on a major transboundary river, the Mekong, that has been increasing in its climate variability quite dramatically over the past 15, 18 years or so, with a kind of a really extreme floods and really extreme droughts that have not been seen for quite a long time, often happening in close succession to each other. And most of its energy is coming from hydropower. And so I have a colleague. He was called in by the mayor of Udon Thani about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and this mayor he did something that I thought was really interesting. He had I think a very refreshing perspective, and one of the kind of conceptual challenges that we have around climate change is because the cone of variability is increasing in the future. People like Stefan Hollegod and others at the World Bank have talked about deep uncertainty, that we don't know really if the future is going to be drier, or it's going to be wetter, or it's going to be a mixture of those two, and it makes it much harder to kind of think and invest and plan. And this mayor, when confronted with this increasing basket of problems, more urban flooding, less reliable hydropower generation, increasing energy agriculture competition, he actually said to my colleague who was brought in as a technical advisor, we need to stop thinking about these as separate problems. Water is actually across all of these. We need to think about them as a single problem. Water is the connective tissue, and it's led us in Agua to talk about the idea of deep resilience as the answer to deep uncertainty. So in this case, they said, the traditional approach is to divide and conquer. We narrowly define problems. We try to make sure that we're only talking about a reservoir operation with the hydropower. We're only talking about a seasonal storage with the farmers for irrigation. We have the DRR crew that are focused in urban flooding. This mayor, he said, actually, it's more important to we need the technical experts in all of those areas, but we also really need to do is bring in the larger community and open up this larger discussion. I think that's in many ways what Mahjong is talking about at a kind of national scale, to make sure that all eyes are looking, and this is this kind of bottom-up approach that I really like that Mahjong used that phrase. It's opposite to the way that we have really thought about our water decision in the past. What this mayor said was, actually, by bringing more voices together, we will have a more comprehensive solution. That people will naturally begin to make these kinds of connections themselves, and will come up with a better approach. So Udon the solution that they ended up settling on was a series of nature-based solutions, a series of urban lakes that they've created. They're in the final stages of actually constructing them. And interestingly, the kind of last piece that this mayor really locked onto was, he said, I want to make sure that my kids, that they don't feel like they're compelled for economic reasons or quality of life reasons to move to Bangkok or to some other city. That actually this is a resilient community conceived broadly. That there's a kind of harmonious a connection, flexible connection between these different sectors. That this place remains a good place to live, and that we actually are bringing ecosystems into the community. I'd say China's been a leader in that too, with a very similar approach that in China is called sponge cities. A brilliant, beautiful example with a lovely name too, typically a kind of poetic Chinese name. I think, to me, that's a very affirming, a positive example about how we can really apply this kind of literally this kind of eco-civilization view within a water resilience framework. Thanks.
Thank you for that. You kind of, I'm actually, end of November, I'm going to be setting up a wetland meeting, because China did just pass a wetland protection law. They're banning development along coasts. So but again, but as Mahjong mentioned, a lot of this is top down, and I'm sure, Mahjong, you'd admit that sometimes people aren't brought into the conversation, like on the Yangtze River Protection Law, where they suddenly said no one can fish on it. I don't think the aquaculture and the fishers were consulted on that, but it was done. I don't know if you want to say anything, Mahjong, or if I should pop over to Suzanne. You okay? Okay, Suzanne. So now kind of to you, because you gave some, it was, don't want to say it was very sobering, the kind of news, the trends that you were talking about in MENA. And you talked about, there were 3 areas where things need to change. You were talking a lot about, we need better water governance. And someone, a woman, Sabine Blumstein, said, Suzanne, could you elaborate a bit more on the potential for turning conflict potential into cooperation? What are the instruments that can be used, and how to implement them, considering political instabilities and capacity challenges that we've seen? So, and I think that kind of begs, just like I asked John, maybe give us an example. If it's still gloom and doom, it's fine, but just, tell us a little bit story about. But I think, though, that this transition, because you've seen it elsewhere outside the region, how do we get from water conflict to cooperation?
Yeah, I think it's actually not all doom and gloom, because what we know from various regions around the world, including also some examples in the MENA region, is that generally water tends to bring people, countries together, simply because the interdependence that water creates, think of transboundary rivers or lakes, also aquifers, at some point requires people, requires governments to enter into cooperation. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, very simply put, fighting over water, whether that's between people or between countries, is an extremely costly option that especially countries hardly ever want to take. So if we look at the transboundary level only, there's hardly ever any violence, and there has never been a formally declared war over water between countries. It's a bit different at the local level, where we see more intercommunal, intersectoral violence over water, but even that also usually linked to other reasons. So it's not the case that water would be at the origin, would be the cause of such conflict, but more water might sort of be the last drip that makes things boil over. So yeah, water being a source of cooperation. What we see is that the integrated management of water resources, bringing different people, different sectors together, creates a ton of benefits. Those can be benefits, economic benefits, can be societal benefits, can be benefits in terms of flood protection and saving human lives. But the challenge here is, and I think that's where the MENA region is maybe struggling a little bit more than other regions, is that these benefits need to be acknowledged. So policymakers, but also the population, actually needs to see that in the long run, engaging in cooperation is more beneficial for a country and for people than engaging in conflict. Very often, however, as we all know, and that is something that holds for the entire world, decision-making, policy-making is driven by short-term considerations, very often also driven by national considerations. That don't necessarily bring in that long-term perspective, because yeah, you talk about election cycles, you talk about interests of political leaders, especially in countries where the population in general might have little to no say when it comes to making decisions for the country's future. So the struggle really is to highlight these benefits and make countries act on them. And I think I can think of a few examples where that has indeed happened. I'm thinking of Southern Africa, for example, the Orange River Basin, which is fed by Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, and South Africa, and is a very water scarce region. It's a region that's maybe not as water scarce as parts of the MENA region, but is struggling with water scarcity. But their countries have come together and have signed a legally binding treaty and have established a basin organization, and that basin organization has helped them in the last drought in 2015 and following years, which was a severe drought, has helped them to actually address a conflict. So there was a conflict emerging similar to what we've seen in the MENA region, where one country, in that case Botswana, was suffering a severe drought, but felt that it did not get enough water, or it did not get its share of the Orange River, which was already shared and developed by upstream Lesotho and South Africa. Kind of similar if you think about the Euphrates-Tigris, right, where there are upstream developments happening and downstream Iraq fields that is not getting its share. But what happened there is that the countries brought the basin organization in. They had a platform to negotiate already, and ultimately decided that if they were to jointly expand a water transfer scheme across these countries, they would actually be better off in terms of water supply, but also in terms of being able to fund this, to acquire funds from external donors. So they have mandated the basin organization that brings together all the countries to actually move ahead with the feasibility study for that project, and the organization will also help oversee the development. So a situation kind of similar to basins that we see in the MENA region, but clearly with a more long-term perspective. There are other examples in other regions as well, but in the MENA region, except for the Jordan Basin, there is not a lot of institutionalized cooperation.
It's funny you mentioned that, because John just gave me a private chat and say, can I talk about Jordan River after she talks? So John, over to you.
Thanks. I'm based on the Pacific coast of the U.S., but last week I was in D.C. and was able to meet face to face with some colleagues with a very interesting NGO called EcoPeace Middle East. They're a Jordan River focused organization that spans 3 countries, Palestine, Jordan, and Israel, and they even have 3 directors representing each one of those countries. And they're a mature organization. They've been very effective for maybe 20 years. But what's interesting to me is that they're really starting to evolve. I think in response to the stakeholder concerns across the region in a very transboundary sense. All 3 of the co-directors really strongly emphasize that there's this deep shared sense of risk across the region from climate change that's new, and also this the easy temptation is to say we need to effectively build our own castles. We need to separate ourselves from our neighbors, from each other, and take care of ourselves, and try and be as isolated and independent as we can. But just following up on Susanna's point, this sense that there's an advantage in sharing. I think this is actually one of the maybe surprisingly positive things that's come from climate change, is that this shared sense of risk is actually leading to a shared sense of action. So in Israel, for instance, survey data suggests that maybe 20-25% of Israeli citizens support a 2-state solution between Israel and Palestine, but 70% support a regional approach to shared water resources. And that's very powerful. And to follow up on the South African example, there's a really good Cape Town-based NGO called Green Cape that during the Day Zero crisis in Cape Town, they were specifically engaging with businesses, and businesses they actually started off maybe echoing some of Mahjong's experience too, with this kind of isolation. We need to protect ourselves, our business, our own operations, and over the Day Zero crisis, they really opened up in their definition about what they needed to be doing to respond to water scarcity. And many businesses by the end of the Day Zero crisis had reached a level of awareness where they said, if our employees' kids are not able to take a shower in the morning, if they're not able to have a hot lunch, then our business is not resilient. That actually the whole community needs to be resilient in order for us as an individual business to be resilient. And I think that's an important and useful evolution that we're starting to see, I hope, accelerate.
And then Suzanne has a 2-finger. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add what John was saying, that an increasing crisis can also be an opportunity. I think that's definitely something that we're seeing with climate change, where countries see the need to act and to act collectively. And it's quite interesting that there's research on this that confirms it. Research focusing specifically on transboundary rivers, but I think equally applies to the more local and national level, which is only when water scarcity or water pollution increases, cooperation also increases. If there is no problem, so to say, there's very little incentive to cooperate. And I'm not saying there haven't been problems before, but I think climate change can really be a trigger as countries acknowledge that they have to cooperate. However, that research also shows that there's a certain tipping point beyond which the challenges are so high or seem so difficult that countries then resort back to unilateral action. And I think we're approaching we're close to that tipping point where action really becomes possible, but I think we also must ensure that we don't miss the opportunity.
Thank you. And you actually teed up the question I had for Mahjong. Because so we've been talking about some transboundary stuff, but okay, and Mahjong, you gave us some great news about how water pollution issues, there's been a lot of coming together, better laws, citizen involvement, your involvement. But now and because in the past, we often used to say that China had a water pollution was a major source of water scarcity because it was so dirty you couldn't consume it. Now, what about water quantity issues in China? Because I mean, we had this huge, I mean, they had to just open up the dams and they got the water downstream. The PLA came in, delivered water to people, but China can't live that way. I mean, the fact that you said 7 cups of water that you have up in Beijing are coming from the South North Water Transfer Project, and the Yangtze River just was drying up. So talk to us a little bit about, what are you seeing? Are you seeing some opportunity? I mean, there's an opportunity, but do you think is there some kind of action that we're going to start seeing where China maybe is going to switch from the supply side management of water to more demand? I'll leave it at that. Too wordy.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for this great question. And when it comes to water shortage, yes, I mentioned China's, in the northern part of China, absolute shortage of resources per capita. And then when it comes to water quality, we in the southern part of China, there's also this scarcity caused by the water pollution, so basically, you have 2 ways to really address this shortage. One is to expand supply, and the other is to manage your demand and to increase your efficiency and resort to water pollution control and recycle, reuse of your limited resources. And over the past, I would say, decades of time, 5, 6 decades, we continue to focus more on the expansion of supply side, build dams and then reservoirs, drilling wells deeper and deeper, and overdraft our aquifer to an extent that we suffered very, very seriously from that, making the whole the use of the water supply, the North China Plain, almost like totally unsustainable. I mean, that cornered us into building the South to North Water Diversion Project. So this very fact that we have to depend on our water supply through a canal 1,200 kilometers long, and to those experts, it's still not enough. We need to further extend that. New kind of transfer projects have been done to mitigate the losses of so much water from the Han River, mid and lower reach of the source of that diversion. I mean, this is so basically we bought this South to North Water Diversion Project to help China to avoid a real water crisis, and bought us quite some time, I would say, but we need to really make a serious decision whether we need to. It's time for us to switch our strategy for to prioritize on the water conservation side. On that side, we still haven't done enough. Far from being enough. In the city with such a low, very, very low per capita resources, 120 cubic meters in Beijing. Our water consumption per person is kind of higher than some of those in Europe, and which have a lot more water. So I would say, water conservation side, we haven't made big enough progress. And John very kindly mentioned about Sponge City. I think it's very, very good concept, and a lot of engineering projects have also been conducted to help save the rainstorm water, and very, very helpful. But in the meantime, when people open the tap, when the business, get their supply and the people open their tap, they still haven't very much understand that this is probably the capital, one of the capital in the world with the lowest water per capita resources. So I think a lot more needs to be done on that part, and if we don't, then our water supply still cannot be said sustainable. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm all about water recycling. Copy Singapore. But okay, John, you have a couple of questions that you want to ask Majun and Susan. You had a couple of questions.
Yeah, maybe first for Susanna. I'd say Susanna and I have known each other for a really long time, and I'd say I call this maybe part of an ongoing discussion. I feel like we have, especially at a transboundary level, we're trying to think about how to make sure that countries are able to cooperate, that we're de-risking or deconflicting a lot of significant regions, and when we have water agreements that are in place, my sense is that governance can in effect act as a kind of rigid infrastructure, like really structuring our choices in the future. And some of these pieces of governance they're written in a way that they also match a past climate. So how do we, I'd be curious, like, your thoughts about how we try to make sure that, say, the relationship between India and Pakistan, or maybe for some of the aquifers in West Africa, even the U.S. and Mexico, how we think about transboundary agreements as dynamic instruments that facilitate resilience.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that is indeed a key question, because of course governance really matters, but it also has to be good in order to take us on the road towards resilience. And treaties are indeed a key element here. I would say that the main challenge are treaties that allocate water, keeping in mind that many of the more than 600 treaties that exist on transboundary waters actually don't do that, but deal with other things, be it pollution, be it fisheries, and other things. But the treaties that do provide for allocation, they become problematic if they define fixed amounts. So if they say country A gets so much and country B gets so much, but then as a consequence of climate change, there's actually less than the sum of the two in the river. And we're seeing this, for example, with the Helmand Treaty between Afghanistan and Iran, where certain volumes are defined, but now Afghanistan claims that it cannot provide these volumes to Iran because the river doesn't have that much water in it. There are other challenges with regards to monitoring the water levels and nobody really knowing how much water is in there due to all the consequences of the conflict there. But this is really a key issue. In India, Pakistan is a little bit different because they're not absolute volumes allocated, but parts of the rivers or tributaries to the main Indus River are being assigned to either Pakistan or India. But of course, also there, if the flows of these rivers change, especially if they do so unequally across the distribution of the rivers, that's going to lead to challenges. So when it comes to treaties, it's really crucial to think about how to manage or how to set up allocation schemes in a way that they're climate resilient, that they can also deal with drought years, for example. But I think more importantly, we also have to move beyond these allocation mechanisms. I think we're past the time where we can say country A gets 50%, country B gets 50%, and that's it. Because that always keeps us in that zero-sum logic, right? It keeps us in that logic that if you get more, I get less, and that is the recipe for conflict. I think the idea that water management and water governance has since some years is to really move beyond and look at what are the benefits. So what do you gain from flood protection? What do you gain from agricultural production? What do you gain from improved navigability of a river? And look more at how to share those. So I think governance will remain a limiting factor if we have these old, as you say, John, rigid regimes. Luckily, to add a positive note here, there are not that many treaties around the world that have these rigid regimes, and those obviously need to be addressed, need to change. On a less positive note, there are a lot of basins that have so far not dealt with allocation at all because they didn't have to. Like think about many of the European basins where we had so many droughts in the especially last 2 years, that nobody ever would have imagined, right? I mean, I'm in the Netherlands and we had a drought and water had to be limited, and nobody would have ever thought of the Netherlands as a place where this would happen. So that's places where there are not even such governance regimes in place that also have to be established. But I agree with you that those have to be designed in a resilient manner.
That's great. So I think we're coming down. We've got just about 6 more minutes left, and I was thinking that we're having this conversation right before the climate COP coming up, and I know that John, you're going. I don't know if Suzanne or Majun, if you're going or going to be there virtually, but what maybe just like, well, John, you're going to go. I mean, what is it that we want that you guys maybe answer me one at a time quickly? What is it you want to see happening at this international level to really create some action on the kind of governance and transparency issues that we talked about today? John?
Well, thanks for that question, Jennifer. I think it's actually a really important one. AGWA is a network, and we are really formed as a network of water professionals, technical professionals across the kind of full spectrum of disciplines in water. But I'd say where a lot of our growth has actually been recently, and kind of an increasing part of our audience has been on the side of climate professionals, which is really a new category, and they really are coming to us because they see that most of their problems are water problems, and that's really the point of this session. Where we, if we go back to the to 2015, to the Paris Agreement, where we created this hopefully useful, effective framework about how to solve the kind of larger climate crisis. The kind of key innovation there was creating a way for countries to develop a national climate plan that focuses on the greenhouse gas side, and it focuses on the adaptation and resilience side. Those launched last year in Glasgow. They're 5-year plans. They get revised every 5 years from now on, and they're supposed to increase in ambition. What we've been doing is working actively with countries in that space. So I personally have worked with over 100 countries on their national climate plans, and talking about where water is embedded both on the mitigation side and on the adaptation and resilience side. What we've started to do, especially over the last 18 months, 20 months, is to go into much more detail. A close colleague, Kelsey Harpham, running something called the Water Tracker for National Climate Planning. She works with national governments. It's up to around 24 now, to go in much more depth to be able to see where there may be potential water conflicts and synergies that are embedded inside. So these are called NDCs as a policy instrument. So and we're finding the COP process is that water is really rising to the top of the agenda. Glasgow arguably was a kind of the first time that adaptation resilience came to kind of equal footing with climate mitigation issues. And Egypt, I think, has done a good job in essentially making adaptation resilience the primary issue of the COP. And UAE will be the follow-up a country for COP 28 next year. Perhaps Australia the year after. These are all going to be water COPs, so this sense of kind of a synergy or an alignment process between water and climate, I think is really here to stay. And I find it interesting that this sense of innovation, of alignment, of allyship is coming very strongly from the climate community.
You get a gold star for water is rising at the COPs, by the way. Majun, maybe kind of, so China, you guys are a big dog at the COPs, right? But China just passed a new, they have an adaptation plan now. I mean, do you think that China is going to be bringing some of its, I mean, they're new in the adaptation game. Do you think they're going to be bringing water to the table at the COP in Egypt?
Yeah, I think China will talk about adaptation, and China will, especially when this time the COP will be held for the first time in a, not sure whether it's first time, but anyway, in a developing country. So I think many developing countries are they concerned more on the adaptation side. So there will be some sharing of this, but we understand that as the largest current greenhouse gas emitter in the world, discharging about nearly a third of the global total, and still not picking at this moment. So I think, by far the biggest challenge is how to work together to reduce the emissions to mitigate the climate change. And obviously, with the COVID situation still linger on, and a turbulent economic situation, and energy shortage globally, and then the geopolitical tension, with a war in Europe, I think the priority have been shifted by most of the major economies on other issues. I think that's the biggest challenge. And now, how to refocus this on the climate issue, on the climate related water issue, and how do we build trust and confidence, and to try to deny all this misinformation about other countries, giving up their climate agenda and all of this. I think that will be a very, very tough issue for this COP. This time it won't be. I hope that everyone's got a more holding a more realistic bill, that now it's time to really consolidate what has been promised and try to really implement them in this very, very difficult situation when so much coal capacity have been released globally.
Thank you, Majun. And Suzanne, I want to give you just a moment to make some closing comment, that some insights or thoughts that you have about the upcoming COP, or what your continued work will be, and contributing to these kind of conversations.
Well, I really hope that the COP will indeed pick up water as a key topic. I mean, climate change is water, water is climate change, but I am a bit less optimistic than John. I've just been at the UN General Assembly meeting for the water conference next year in New York, and every statement that a country or a stakeholder made was about climate change and water. And I would like to see something similar in the COP. I want to see that in the national statements that are being made at the COP, water is as prominent as climate change was in the water meeting. And ultimately, I would hope that these two processes are being brought together. The COP was mentioned in the UNGA event in New York, but I'm not sure whether the upcoming water conference, which is the first big water conference since 1977 at the international level, whether that will actually be mentioned and really pushed for in the COP. And I agree with Majun that there is quite a risk that these short-term crises actually overshadow our long-term engagement, and that in that context, we keep on finding ourselves in a crisis response cycle instead of moving towards resilience and addressing the root causes of crisis. That might not be the most optimistic note to end on.
Okay.
I leave
That's
that
okay.
to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, but we got to be, it's a tough problem, but it's, I think, clear across all of you today. Pay attention to water, people. And I'll be continuing these conversations on water for, I don't know, I'm never going to stop. Want to thank all, we're going to have a wetland meeting next month, but again, I'm doing this Vulnerable Deltas project, so I'll probably bring you guys back in different combos later with different speakers focusing just on China and just on Southeast Asia. But thank you so much for those of you tuning in. I did get someone asking if they wanted to see Majun, they wanted to see your contact slide. So send me your slides so I can put that last slide up on our website, because people are interested in your map now. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day, and be good. Conserve water. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, John and Suzanne. Learned so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.